Welcome to the webinar number 4 for We Belong, and this webinar will be focusing on risk management. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the Sport Law and Strategy Group as well as True Sport for providing this information on risk management. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is risk management. So for many of us, when we think of risk or risk management, we think about safety and risky behavior. But risk management actually does include this, but it also is looking at anything that can have any impact on achieving your desired outcomes with what you're doing or in your programming. So we assess the risk of doing something and not doing something. So when we think about risk, what is it? So risk is the chance of something happening that can have an impact on achieving your desired outcomes. What's risk management then? So risk management is the process used to identify, assess, and treat risks so as to better achieve your desired outcomes. When we look at the evolution of risk management, the traditional approach that began in the 1980s was the focus on injury prevention that many of us would remember. In the 1990s, we moved to a little bit more of a modern approach, which was focusing on avoiding other losses, so things like legal, financial, and reputation. And then finally, the True Sport approach occurred in the early 2000s. So that's risk management as a comprehensive approach to improve organizational performance. So when we talk about risk management, we talk about identifying risks of various levels or various categories of risk. So what you see on the screen is a number of categories. So we look at risks in terms of compliance, external, financial, governance, communications, operational and or program risks, and finally reputation risks. So those are all categories of risks that people can apply a risk management strategy to. When we look at the risk management process, there is a specific process that we do follow. So the very first thing that we do is establish the content of risk assessment and management. After we've established the content, we then look at identifying the risks. And the guiding question is, what are the things that keep you up at night? And so that's how you can help identify the risks within your organization or within your program. The third thing you would then do is to take the time to analyze the risks. So a guiding question is, what is the likelihood of this situation occurring? The next thing you would do is to evaluate the risks. So how serious is the consequence of this situation for the organization or the program? And the final thing you would do is then treat the risks. So the question here is, what is in place that could be in place to help mitigate or decrease the situation from occurring? And we do have a risk management model that you can apply when you're treating your risks, analyzing them, and evaluating them. So what you see here is this table that shows you a number of different things. So the first thing I want to point out is the different letters. So when you see the L, that means it's identified as a low risk. The M is a medium risk, the H is a high risk, and the VH is a very high risk. The next thing we do with the risk management model is look at the consequence. So if you look at the horizontal axes, the consequence is what would happen if the risk occurred. So the first consequence is the minor one. So it will have an impact on achievement of the objective that can be dealt with through internal adjustments. The second is a moderate consequence. So that will have an impact on some aspects of achievement of the objective and will require changes to strategy or program delivery. The third consequence is that it's serious. It will significantly impact achievement of the objective. And then the fourth is that it's catastrophic. So this will have debilitating impact on the achievement of the objective. And then when we look at the vertical axes, this is the likelihood of the risk occurring. So this has a level too. So the first one is that it's unlikely. So number one, unlikely that it will happen is it's less likely to happen than not. Number two is possible. So it's just as likely to happen as not happen. And then three is that it probably will happen, more likely to happen than not. And then the final category is almost certain. that is sure to happen. So you can see that if you were to place a risk and you would provide it with, it's minor, then it's unlikely, you could see that this was probably identified as a low risk. If you identify the likelihood of something happening that's very high and that it could have catastrophic outcomes or consequences, then that risk would be identified as a very high risk. And then there's other risks that fit into somewhere in the middle of medium and high, depending on how you put them into the model. So then what you would do is you could take a risk that you've decided is within your program, and you could say, okay, what's the likelihood of this happening? What's the likelihood, for example, of your program having no venue, okay, because of maybe there's a flood in the building? The likelihood of that happening, you place it on that continuum, and then the consequence as a result of that. You place it there, and you would see if it's a low, medium, high, or very high risk for your organization. So the next thing you do is you apply risk treatment options. So the first thing you would do, or that you could do in terms of treatment options, is you could retain risks. So each risk level, there's a number of things you can do to treat them. So if you're going to retain the risks, what you are is you don't do anything, or what you're going to do is you wouldn't do anything because the risk is inherent. So for example, if you retain a risk within a program, a physical activity program, let's say you're doing activities in the school, you retain the risk of doing them in the school because you're going to do them there anyway. If you want to reduce the risk, you take steps to reduce the likelihood of occurrence and or the consequence, largely by changing human behavior. So an example of reducing risk would be steps to reduce the likelihood of injury with your participants. So that would be things like you would make sure that your coordinators or facilitators are doing warm-up activities, going over safety rules to reduce those risks. The third thing you can do as a risk treatment option is to transfer the risk. So you accept the level of risk, but you transfer it to others through contracts. So an example of a transfer is when you do insurance, or maybe you contract someone else, some other facilitator, to do the program. You're transferring that risk to someone else or to another organization. And then finally, you would avoid the risk. You decide simply to not do something. So if you were to avoid a risk, that could be an example of you decide not to do a program, maybe because your risk or as you identify the risks, you decide that the risks are simply too high for you to take the risk of running the program. So an interesting diagram is the choice of risk strategy. So we know that risks occur along a continuum from low to high. So low, medium, high, and catastrophic. And if we were to compare that to treatment strategies, they tend to follow a pattern also. So we start at retain, reduce, transfer, avoid. So you can see that they would match up. So if you have identified a low risk within your organization or your program, you're probably going to retain it. If you've identified medium, you may reduce it. If you've identified the risk as high, you may transfer it. And if you identify the risk as catastrophic, you would most likely avoid that risk. So the thing to keep in mind with risk management is that most times the solutions are easy. If you take the time to put risk management measures in place, safety and the likelihood of the risk occurring is greatly decreased. So that concludes the risk management portion of the We Belong webinars. So if you would like more information on this, you can visit the Sport Law website. The Sport Law and Strategy Group will have more information on risk management. Thank you for listening.